today we're going to talk about the difference between having favorites and playing favorites. Because as we'll see, God has something to say about this. And it's pretty radical. I had my mom dig out my old Letterman jacket out of her basement. And as you can see, I was in high school in the 90s, in the late 90s. And I have memories of being the favorite and of being overlooked when I wasn't the favorite. And to be honest, neither one is really all that great. Learning to navigate favoritism is a skill I can still use even as an adult. Here's an example of how favoritism can play out. Like we mentioned last week, there were a lot of people who thought Jesus was too radical. In this series, we're looking to the Bible for practical advice on how to change the world with God's radical love. And that search has led us to the book of James. This book is a letter written by a guy named James who actually grew up with Jesus. Can you imagine growing up with Jesus? I wonder if James ever felt like Jesus was everyone's favorite. Because James knew Jesus so well, the letter he wrote is packed with summaries of Jesus's teaching, retold in James' own words. James is known for his straightforward instructions for how to follow Jesus. These teachings might seem simple, but they have the power to create radical change. So let's see what James has to say about favoritism. Read James chapter 2, verses 1 through 10 as a group. You'll notice that James has a lot to say about the rich and the poor. After reading through it once as a group, I want you to read through it a second time, replacing the words rich and poor with words like popular and unpopular, or people like me and people that are different than me, or my friends and everyone else. See if that makes the message a little more relatable to you. Is James saying that we can't have best friends or a favorite group of people to hang out with? No. Remember, there's a difference between having favorites and playing favorites. In this passage, James has a lot to say about the rich and the poor. Maybe people's wealth isn't something that you think about all that often, but oftentimes maybe we're much more aware of who's well-liked and who has the most power in our social groups. James is not down with showing favoritism. In fact, he forbids it. According to James, God is not happy when we choose favorites based upon what people have, like money, popularity, or power. When we ignore people without things like money, popularity, or power. Or when we mistreat, dishonor, shame, exclude, or fail to love people because we see them as less important than other people. Then James says something interesting in verse 5. He says God chooses to bless the poor. Wait, does that mean that God plays favorites? But maybe he does in the opposite way you and I usually do. So let's explore that idea more deeply. To help us make sense of this, let's look at the Old Testament book of Proverbs. It's a collection of short sayings that share wisdom about how followers of God should live. Read Proverbs chapter 22, verses 1 to 2, 8 to 9, and 22 to 23. If God is the creator of everyone, rich and poor, popular and unpopular, powerful and not so powerful, it's safe to say that God doesn't play favorites. We're all equally loved by God. But it is clear that God notices when certain people are more in need than others. God knows that not all of us are given equal treatment or equal opportunities in this world. And God seems to understand our tendency to show favoritism to people that we already like or admire. We need the reminder to care for people who aren't like us, who aren't cool or popular or wealthy. So does God play favorites? No, but you and I do. And God is just trying to teach us to be more just and fair, like he is. Can you see some similarities between this proverb and James's advice? James said playing favorites broke God's law, and this proverb helps us understand more about what that means. This passage helps us see that showing favoritism is injustice, and injustice has dangerous consequences. If we play favorites by harming or excluding others, God will stand against us and defend the people who are being harmed. That's kind of scary. So what's the alternative? Instead of playing favorites, we can treat everyone like they're made by God, because they are. We can be generous with everyone, but especially those who really need it. That's the kind of kingdom Jesus has left for you and I to create on this earth. One where we conquer with generosity and friendship, not power plays and greed. We earlier said that James really summarizes Jesus' teaching. This teaching sounds an awful lot like one of Jesus' most radical teachings called the Sermon on the Mount, which we can find in the Gospel of Matthew. So take a look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 46 to 48 to see what Jesus is teaching us about how to follow him. Jesus is telling us that we are called to be different. Everyone who loves those that are just like them or who can give them stuff, what makes them any different than anybody else? When we treat everyone as children of God and when we reach out especially to those who are poor or experiencing injustice, that's when we're bringing about the kingdom that Jesus wants us to build on this earth. Jesus is really challenging us to be radically different in our relationships. He's telling us everyone likes to hang out with people who like them, or who give them nice things, or who do fun things for them. What makes followers of Jesus radical is that we treat everyone as children of God. We don't play favorites, because Jesus calls us to remember more about what bonds us than what separates us. Can you imagine how your family, friends, school, or the world would be different if everyone treated each other this way? If we could learn how to have favorites without playing favorites, the world would be different. So do you want to see radical change? Are you not sure what you think about Jesus yet, but you know you want to see more good and less hate in the world? Then James tells us to love like Jesus. Radical people don't play favorites.